I had built a life of independence and success, only to watch it threatened by the man I once trusted above all, my ex-husband, Richard Reynolds. After decades together, he had plotted to humiliate me publicly, claiming my business was a sham. But what he didn't know was that every lie he had spun had left a trail of evidence, and I had been quietly following it. When he hired private investigators to prove I was lying, I realized this was not just an attack, it was an opportunity. Opportunity to expose the truth, to reveal his fraud, and to reclaim my power. On the day of our daughter's birthday, as investigators walked in, the entire room would soon witness a shocking twist that neither he nor I could have predicted. My name is Victoria Reynolds. I am 52 years old. Today should have been filled with joy and laughter for my daughter's birthday, but a cold knot of suspicion had formed in my chest the moment I woke up. Richard, my ex-husband, had always resented my independence and success, but lately his moves had become more calculated, more dangerous. For months I had felt the subtle pricks of his manipulations, strange calls, whispered rumors, and shadows that seemed to follow me everywhere. I knew he was planning something, and I could sense the storm gathering just beyond my door. Little did I know this storm would come disguised as the very people he sent to ruin me, and today I would witness the first sparks of his trap unraveling in ways even I couldn't predict. Richard Reynolds has secretly hired private investigators to dig into every aspect of my business, determined to find any detail that could prove I was a fraud. He thought he could humiliate me publicly, destroy my reputation, and finally regain the power he believed he had lost. As I went about my morning reviewing documents and preparing for the party, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching my every move. There was a tension in the air, a silent countdown I could feel in my bones. Richard believed he had complete control, but I had learned long ago that people underestimate the quiet patience of a woman who refuses to be broken. I noticed the investigators first as shadows outside my office, lingering in parked cars and blending with passers-by. Every call I received felt like a test, every unexpected visitor a probe into my life. I played my part, maintaining calm and normalcy while mentally preparing for the confrontation I knew was inevitable. My daughter's birthday was only hours away, and yet the weight of Richard's scheme pressed on me like a storm cloud. I realized that these investigators, though seemingly neutral, held the key to either my ruin or my vindication. Their reactions could tip the balance, and I had to watch closely, measuring every glance, every hesitation, every twitch of recognition that hinted at the truth they were slowly uncovering. As the invitations went out and guests began arriving, the atmosphere of excitement and laughter masked the tension that lay just beneath the surface. Richard, dressed impeccably and brimming with confidence, made his entrance with an exaggerated swagger, whispering instructions to the investigators. He planned to orchestrate the perfect humiliation in front of everyone, believing that the room would serve as the stage for my disgrace. Yet even as he surveyed the scene, I noticed subtle shifts in the investigator's demeanor. Small expressions, exchanged glances, barely noticeable reactions that told a story Richard had not anticipated. I felt a thrill of anticipation, knowing that the trap he had set might not work exactly the way he intended. The investigators finally began reviewing my company's records in front of Richard, flipping through spreadsheets, contracts, and invoices. Richard leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with certainty, fully convinced that his plan was flawless. But as the pages turned and the data was scanned, subtle signs of disbelief crossed their faces. My pulse raced as I watched the moment he thought
he held all the power to start to slip. Every careful arrangement Richard had made to paint me as a fraud began showing cracks, and I realized that even those he had hired as instruments of my destruction were slowly becoming witnesses to his own vulnerabilities. I kept a calm facade, but inside my mind raced, analyzing every detail of the unfolding scene. One investigator paused, whispered to another, then looked directly at Richard with an intensity that froze him mid-step. The guests continued to mingle, oblivious to the storm building around the documents and discussions. I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps the truth was closer than I had anticipated. Richard's arrogance and overconfidence had blinded him, and the very investigators he believed were his allies were already questioning his narrative. It was a moment suspended in tension, where one misstep could completely unravel the years he had spent weaving his lies. Then the moment came that changed everything. The investigators looked squarely at Richard and with a quiet but firm tone delivered the words that left him pale and speechless. "Sir, you're under arrest." The room fell silent as every guest turned in shock, staring at the man who had so confidently planned my humiliation. Relief and triumph coursed through me, tempered by the knowledge that the battle was far from over. What had begun as a cruel scheme to destroy me had backfired spectacularly, exposing his own fraud in front of everyone. The trap was now fully reversed, and Richard's carefully constructed facade was crumbling before my eyes. The investigators, under Richard Reynolds' instruction, began combing through every financial statement, contract, and ledger linked to my company. But as they dug deeper, inconsistencies in Richard's own accounts began to emerge, faint but undeniable. Each transaction they flagged painted a story of deception and hidden manipulation that had been carefully disguised for years. I watched silently, heart pounding, as the people meant to prove my fraud started whispering to one another, their expressions shifting from professional neutrality to growing suspicion. I realized that the trap Richard had built might be turning against him. Every carefully hidden detail of his financial misconduct was now being unearthed, and the very investigators he had hired to destroy me were beginning to see the truth, and it was far worse than anyone could have imagined. I took a deep breath and began quietly compiling my own proof of Richard's fraud. Years of careful record-keeping, emails, and receipts formed a chain of undeniable evidence. I knew the moment had to come when everything would align perfectly: the investigators' growing doubts, the party's imminent start, and the unsuspecting guests ready to witness a public humiliation. But instead of panicking, I focused on control. Each piece of evidence I organized was like laying another brick in a foundation of justice. I could feel the tide shifting, the balance tilting in my favor. Richard had underestimated me, and now I had every tool I needed to turn his cruel plan into his ultimate downfall. Preparations for the birthday party were in full swing, the house filled with laughter, decorations, and the smell of freshly baked cake. Yet beneath this festive surface, the tension was palpable. Richard moved through the room, unaware that the investigators were already questioning the credibility of his claims. I mingled with guests, keeping a cheerful facade, all the while listening to snippets of whispered conversations among the investigators. Every glance, every pause, every subtle gesture heightened my anticipation. I realized that the perfect timing was approaching, the moment when the curtain would lift and Richard's long-hidden deceit would begin to unravel, right in the midst of what he had intended to be my public humiliation. Richard presented his so-called proof to the investigators and selected guests, confidently pointing to documents and charts he believed would end my career. His arrogance filled the room, and he smiled smugly, convinced of his victory. But as the investigators reviewed each item, subtle cracks in his story became apparent. Their furrowed brows and exchanged glances were invisible to him, yet they spoke volumes. I watched, heart racing as the facade Richard had so carefully built started showing the first signs of collapse. His overconfidence had blinded him, and now even his hired allies were beginning to recognize the inconsistencies that would ultimately expose him. The investigators leaned closer to one another, their whispered exchanges deliberate
and urgent. Richard, sensing something amiss, tried to maintain control, but his voice faltered. Guests were blissfully unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. Each new observation the investigators made added weight to the mounting evidence against him. Small, seemingly insignificant details, a mismatched signature, a contradictory invoice, a hidden account, began to form a pattern that pointed to Richard's deception. I could feel my confidence growing as I watched him slowly unravel in front of the very people he thought would solidify his lies. Even the smallest inconsistencies now became glaring. One of the investigators paused, looked directly at Richard, and shook his head subtly. The facade of control Richard had maintained for years was weakening, and I could see panic flicker across his face. My heart pounded as I realized that his carefully constructed image of dominance was starting to crumble in real time. Every whispered conversation, every subtle gesture by the investigators was a brick removed from the wall he had built to trap me. And in that moment, I knew the real exposure was about to begin, and there was no turning back. The final moments before the party reached a fever pitch. I quietly organized the evidence and prepared to act the moment the investigators signaled. Richard paced, oblivious to the storm gathering against him, while I felt the tide fully turning in my favor. Every doubt, every shred of proof pointing to his fraud was now ready to be revealed at the perfect moment. The trap he had set to humiliate me was about to snap back on him, and I could finally feel the satisfaction of knowing the justice was no longer a distant dream. It was imminent, inevitable, and utterly satisfying. The investigators, having gathered irrefutable evidence of Richard Reynolds' hidden fraud, pulled him aside discreetly, away from the oblivious party guests. Their tone was calm but firm, their words precise, leaving no room for manipulation or excuse. Richard's confident demeanor faltered as they laid out the discrepancies, pointing to accounts, invoices, and transactions he had hoped would remain hidden. His mind raced, struggling to maintain control, but the web of deceit he had spun over decades was collapsing in front of him. I observed from a distance, carefully noting every reaction, knowing that this confrontation was the first real crack in the armor he had built to humiliate me. It was a quiet but decisive moment that would set the stage for his public undoing. Victoria Reynolds moved through the room with practiced grace, positioning herself perfectly to reveal Richard's lies when the moment was right. She smiled at guests, engaged in light conversation, all while carefully watching the subtle cues from the investigators. Every gesture, every whisper from the team was a signal, and Victoria felt the weight of anticipation building. She had orchestrated this carefully. The evidence, the timing, and the witnesses were all aligned for maximum impact. As Richard remained unaware of the mounting tension, she felt a surge of control and satisfaction. Today, the game would finally shift in her favor, and the truth she had long defended would emerge at the perfect, most public moment. Guests began to notice the strange undercurrent in the room. Subtle glances, nervous whispers, and fleeting expressions of confusion spread through the crowd. The laughter and music seemed to falter as a silent tension gripped the air. Victoria maintained her composure, engaging politely, but her eyes were sharp, scanning every reaction. Richard, oblivious to the whispers and the growing realization among the investigators, continued his performance, confident that his plan was intact.
Yet, with each passing second, the tension grew, and the audience, unwitting witnesses to a high-stakes confrontation, was becoming ready for the shocking revelation that was about to unfold. Richard's carefully maintained composure began to crumble as inconsistencies in his story emerged during private discussions with the investigators. He tried to interject to redirect the narrative, but every excuse was met with calm, factual rebuttals. His panic became visible, a slight tremor in his hands, a faltering smile, a glance that betrayed rising fear. Victoria watched silently, noting every flicker of doubt, every small gesture that revealed the unraveling of his confidence. Years of arrogance and calculated manipulation were failing him in real time, and she felt a quiet satisfaction as the man who had tried to destroy her now struggled to contain the consequences of his own deceit. Victoria's lawyer quietly approached, and the gathered evidence of Richard's fraud was handed over, meticulously organized and undeniable. Financial records, email trails, and witness statements painted a damning picture, leaving no room for defense. Richard's expression shifted from disbelief to desperation, realizing that the walls were closing in on him. Victoria felt a sense of triumph, tempered with patience. This was not about immediate retaliation, but precise justice. Each document, each piece of evidence was a testament to years of careful preparation, and now it was ready to confront Richard at the very moment he had intended to humiliate her. A hidden recording surfaced unexpectedly, capturing Richard's own voice, admitting to the fraud and his plan to destroy Victoria's credibility. The investigators played it quietly, letting the words sink in, and Victoria's heart raced as she realized the magnitude of the revelation. The recording corroborated everything else the investigators had discovered, leaving Richard cornered with irrefutable proof of his betrayal. The tension in the room intensified as Victoria prepared herself, knowing that once this recording went public, there would be no escaping accountability. Every carefully laid plan of his was about to collapse under the weight of his own words. Victoria took a final deep breath, feeling the full force of anticipation and determination. The investigators signaled subtly that the moment was ripe. Guests were unwittingly on the cusp of witnessing a dramatic unmasking. Richard remained oblivious, still smug and confident, but Victoria knew that in moments the truth would explode into the room. She positioned herself near the center, the perfect vantage point to control the narrative and ensure maximum impact. Every detail had been orchestrated, and as she prepared to publicly expose him, she felt an intoxicating mix of relief, triumph, and empowerment. The stage was set, and justice was about to unfold spectacularly. The birthday party for Victoria's daughter was in full swing, filled with laughter, balloons, and the clinking of glasses. Richard Reynolds entered with his usual arrogance, radiating confidence, convinced that the stage was perfectly set for Victoria's public humiliation. Guests mingled blissfully, unaware of the storm beneath the surface. Victoria moved gracefully through the crowd, masking her anticipation with warmth, keeping a watchful eye on the investigators who had already started signaling subtle gestures. Every detail mattered, the timing, the arrangement, the readiness of the evidence, because the moment when the trap would snap shut was approaching fast. Victoria's heart raced as she mentally prepared for the perfect reversal, knowing that the very room designed for her humiliation was about to witness Richard's own exposure instead. The investigators, blending with the guests, began signaling to Victoria with subtle nods and discreet gestures, letting her know that the evidence against Richard was ready to be revealed. Each signal heightened the tension, like invisible threads pulling at the fabric of the party. Richard remained oblivious, striding confidently from group to group, sharing laughs that concealed his underlying anxiety. Victoria's pulse quickened with every glance, knowing that the public exposure was imminent. She positioned herself strategically, making sure every key witness, friends, family, and colleagues, was in view to witness the unfolding truth. The room vibrated with suspense, invisible to the guests but palpable to her, as the perfect storm of deception and justice quietly prepared to collide. Victoria seized the first opportunity to speak, gathering the guests' attention with calm, commanding poise. She began to weave a narrative of her own, carefully explaining her integrity, her business achievements, and the years of dedication that Richard had tried to undermine. Her words were precise, cinematic in delivery, designed to contrast with Richard's inflated arrogance. As she spoke, she let subtle hints of the investigator's discoveries filter into the conversation, planting seeds of doubt. Richard shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in energy, but he could not yet fully grasp the storm approaching. Victoria's calm authority drew every eye to her, creating a dramatic tension that held the room in rapt attention. As Victoria continued her speech, the party guests began to notice subtle changes in Richard's behavior: nervous gestures, forced smiles, and restless pacing. Whispers spread across small clusters of people as they sensed that something was not right. The cheerful ambiance of the celebration became fractured by tension and uncertainty. Victoria moved like a conductor of a symphony, guiding the narrative carefully while the investigators prepared the evidence for public revelation. Each guest, previously unaware of the brewing drama, now became an unwitting witness to the unraveling of Richard's deceit. His arrogance began to falter, and Victoria's confidence grew, knowing the stage was set for a spectacular confrontation. Suddenly, the investigators stepped forward and presented the damning evidence of Richard's fraud to the astonished crowd. Financial records, email trails, and recordings revealed years of deception carefully hidden by Richard, now laid bare. The guests gasped, some stepping back in shock, while Richard's face drained of color. He stammered, attempting to explain, but the weight of undeniable truth crushed his every word. Watched calmly, a mix of relief and triumph coursing through her, the room, once meant to humiliate her, had transformed into the arena of Richard's own public downfall. The cinematic moment of reversal was complete, leaving Richard exposed and powerless in front of everyone he had intended to manipulate. Richard's panic escalated as the crowd fully absorbed the shocking revelations. Friends, family, and colleagues stared in disbelief, whispering among themselves. He attempted to regain composure, but his carefully cultivated facade crumbled under scrutiny. Victoria remained poised, observing his every falter, aware that the power had now shifted entirely. The investigators discreetly ensured that authorities were on standby, ready to intervene. Richard's attempts to explain or deny anything fell flat. His arrogance turned into desperation. The room, once a site for her humiliation, was now filled with his unraveling shame, and Victoria felt an exhilarating sense of justice in seeing the man who tried to destroy her finally confronted with his own fraud. With the evidence firmly in place and the crowd witnessing the full extent of Richard's deception, the investigators signaled the authorities to intervene. Officers arrived quietly, but with authority, approaching Richard as he realized that escape was impossible. The tension Emotions in the room reached its peak as the party transformed into a scene of public reckoning. Victoria's daughter, confused but safe, watched her mother handle the chaos with grace. Friends and family murmured their shock and admiration, witnessing justice unfold in real time. Richard, now fully exposed and powerless, was taken into custody, leaving Victoria victorious. The trap he had designed for her humiliation had completely backfired, turning the celebration into his ultimate undoing. If you want to witness how everything finally unfolds and see the shocking conclusion of this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned. You won't want to miss a single moment. The investigators gathered Richard Reynolds in a quiet corner, their expressions unreadable but resolute. They methodically laid out the evidence they had collected over weeks: financial records, email chains, and witness statements that revealed years of deception. Richard, for the first time, felt the weight of his own lies pressing down on him, his confident facade cracking under scrutiny. Each document and recording dismantled the story he had built to humiliate Victoria, leaving him cornered and speechless. Victoria, standing nearby, felt a rush of vindication as she watched the man who had spent decades trying to destroy her, now confronted with the undeniable truth. This moment was not just exposure, it was the first step toward justice, and the tension in the air was palpable as the inevitable unraveling began. Soon the authorities arrived, guided by the investigators, and began questioning Richard with firm, precise questions. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by desperation and flustered denials that fell flat under the weight of concrete evidence. Every lie he attempted to spin only further exposed his deceit, and the officers documented everything meticulously. Victoria observed quietly, her composure a stark contrast to Richard's unraveling panic. Friends, family, and colleagues began murmuring, sensing the full magnitude of the moment. What had started as a private investigation had escalated into an official reckoning, with Richard facing immediate consequences for his years of manipulation, fraud, and betrayal. The energy in the room shifted, signaling the start of the long-awaited justice that Victoria had patiently orchestrated. Victoria remained calm, almost serene, as the layers of Richard's deception collapsed before her eyes. She watched him struggle to explain inconsistencies, his every word contradicted by irrefutable evidence. Years of manipulation, intimidation, and control unraveled in a matter of minutes, and Victoria could feel a sense of relief mingled with triumph coursing through her. The investigators and authorities methodically revealed every fraudulent move he had made, leaving no doubt about his guilt. For the first time, Victoria realized that the power he had tried to wield over her had completely shifted. It was no longer about fear or intimidation. It was about witnessing the full, undeniable triumph of truth over lies. Guests who had been unaware of the behind-the-scenes battle now became direct witnesses to Richard's downfall. Friends, family, and business associates watched as his arrogance and false confidence crumbled in real time. Whispers and shocked expressions spread throughout the room, creating an atmosphere thick with astonishment. Victoria's daughter observed her mother handling the situation with dignity, learning a quiet but powerful lesson in courage and resilience. The investigators calmly presented each piece of evidence in front of the crowd, ensuring that Richard's public exposure was complete. What had been meant to humiliate Victoria became a vivid demonstration of his own guilt, leaving no room for doubt in the minds of those present. With the evidence fully revealed and Richard subdued, Victoria reclaimed control of her business and reputation. She addressed clients, colleagues, and friends, calmly explaining the truth behind the events and reinforcing her integrity. Her authority and poise contrasted sharply with Richard's floundering, highlighting her strength and resilience. Every decision he had manipulated, every smear he had attempted to spread, was now neutralized by the undeniable proof of his wrongdoing. Victoria's confidence radiated, showing that she was no longer just defending herself. She was actively reclaiming the life and legacy that Richard had tried to sabotage for so long. Victoria knelt to hug her daughter, feeling the weight of the ordeal lift as the room slowly regained its calm. Tears of relief and pride mingled in her eyes as she realized that the battle for justice had not only restored her professional reputation, but also preserved the dignity and safety of her family. Every emotional wound inflicted by Richard's manipulations was now met with healing and empowerment. She shared quiet smiles with close friends and allies, acknowledging the support and courage that had carried her through the ordeal. In that moment, Victoria felt a profound sense of closure, knowing that the cycle of betrayal had finally been broken. As the evening wound down, Victoria celebrated her success with a renewed sense of freedom and power. The guests toasted to her resilience, and she allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction, knowing Richard's manipulation could no longer touch her life. The experience had transformed her. Not only had she survived the betrayal, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and fully in control of her destiny. Standing amid her family and allies, Victoria felt the exhilaration of victory, the joy of reclaimed dignity, and the certainty that the future was hers to define. She had turned a cruel plot into her ultimate triumph, leaving Richard powerless and her own legacy untarnished.